Okay, this is kind of like a part two and a further addendum to my last recording, where I'm going to sort of retouch or more in detail go over the point that I was trying to make, somewhat trying to show some kind of similarity between the structure of Islam itself and, in some sense, the structure of the American constitutional framework, which has an interesting parallel. Um, Although I realize how carefully I have to try to tread, because this is a well this is on the face of it, that's quite a stark and confounding claim to make. But essentially, I would say that Islam is trying to do something with sociology, with the law, so that one's private life can be enriched to the point of a focus of spiritual, uh, a personal spiritual journey, as it were. Whereas I think that in some sense, America is trying to do this on the is trying to have a collective journey, a collective spiritual journey. Although some people might say, it's the what I'm saying is the complete reverse of what the true state is. It's the opposite in both cases. And I'm well, obviously I'm sensitive to that. That's why I just said that. But I still hold that my claim is the correct one. That because in some sense, I think what they're both designed to do is explore the concept of prophecy by, in some sense, the sociological system laid down by the Prophet in Islam is there to create a kind of engagement or exploration implicitly, tacitly, in the concept that one must contend in a consistency, a coherence of reason and responsibility within a certain confine, which places the individual in a very clear position which they can't escape from. So, as the individual is forced to confront the situation, they will have to, in some sense, contend with their own reason and responsibility within the structure. Whereas America is doing this collectively. Because, as I've said, all control and power, and in some sense, the king of your structure, whatever the king of your structure is, there is a human need for the gift of the prophet, the spiritual gift of the prophet. It's part of the human condition. And in Christianity, in the doctrine of Christ, famously, one of the huge important concepts is the false prophet is essentially the spirit of the false prophet. Um, is hugely featured in Revelations, for example, which I take to be a psychological treatise essentially, but about how um, overcoming the world happens in and the kingdom comes within one's own. It's not the end of the world; it's the end of your world, essentially. But let me not get too sidetracked. Um, and so, if you are living in any system that has some kind of sovereign claim of sovereignty, claim of authority, claim of control, and enforces and has power, you will tacitly, implicitly, you can't avoid this. You will ask, is my king, is the king of my system one of the prophets? You have to ask that. And in America, essentially, then you have to believe that, well, if you live in a democracy and the democracy has the whip hand over the republic, if the democracy is in force and is the captain of the ship, essentially, which it is, you will implicitly ask, well, is democracy one of the prophets? Are the people collectively one of the prophets? And you can't escape that question. And that question, I submit, is a spiritually problematic question, but the themes of that problem are being produced by the American experiment. We are seeing it, how it functions in real time for those who have a discerning eye to analyze it. But in some sense, the key to start working at, the key to start realizing that what you're witnessing is essentially the kind of ungodliness or the kind of problems that arise with this ungodly question of asking, is the king one of the prophets? That is why God never wanted the nation of Israel, the Jews, to have a king. That's why they didn't. He preferred the judges, because the judges prefer the judges instead create a system of control in which there is a consistent accountability, as it were, and then you look for the gift of the prophet elsewhere. You're not going to invest it in the authority of the state or something like that. Although this is slightly awkward for me to have just said that, because some of that is slightly anachronistic, in terms of the state at which things were at. But in some sense, even in the Old Testament, in the Bible, that they did go through a portion of time when they had kings. In some sense, one could ask, perhaps it's a necessary experiment to run. It's a necessary failure to witness in order to understand why, because to understand why it's wrong is in some sense to know what to do with the world. Okay, so let me tackle the same theme from a completely different thread. So I was recently listening to an interview on the New Culture Forum with Peter Hitchens, and I really do appreciate Peter Hitchens' point of view, although I thematically disagree with his some of his worldview and his framing, which is probably quite a stark and central theme that grounds his worldview. But essentially, I disagree with traditionalism. Not that I disagree with tradition, but I think that we have to ask the question, what is the ultimate value of tradition? And I think that what it boils down to is that tradition is a kind of, and so, I don't want to strawman Peter Hitchens' argument, but he will sometimes take the shortcut of summarizing his general worldview in a kind of utilitarianism where he says essentially the traditional system worked. So we should at least notice that. And that in some sense is an important point. So let's ask why it works. What is the value of tradition? And the value of tradition, I submit, is essentially pedagogy. And there is a place, in some sense, therefore, for tradition, but its place is in the education of children, because children can't solve every developmental hurdle instantaneously. They have to take them one by one. And the ones that they're not dealing with at that time have to be a kind of holistic landscape in which there is some approximate fidelity, and that is essentially something like tradition. And so you give them a traditional picture of things, and you give them deeper insight and a particular understanding on the things in which that they are currently in the form of investigating. And eventually tradition should be eclipsed by understanding and something like an internal locus of control. The idea that you're going to police tradition, that it's going to be a component of the law to be enforced on people is to infantilize people. And there is a hidden cost here, which is that you might get some kind of utilitarian perfection in society, or something, or some kind of utilitarian optimization. Although I would argue that that optimization is at from taking us at sort of quite a lowest common denominator as the baseline of that, and elevating us from that baseline ever so slightly, whereas there could be a much higher synthesis that could be performed if we would just take responsibility and have the temerity, as it were, and the courage, as it were, and the hope to do something better. Okay, I also want to tackle this theme, because I could go so much more on all of these threads, but and I will continue. But let me just add a third thread, which is also leads, which is essentially the same theme as well. The third thread is oh my word! Now I've just slipped my mind. Okay, this is more abstract and purely sort of intellectual and philosophical. Is that the morally corrupting. I mean, I've talked about this, from a psychological perspective, but sort of extracting universals from generalizations. And I do think that identity politics and relying on an objective narrative, which is in some sense also bound, very similar to sort of trying to create an intellectual paradigm or a which can be regarded as a prophet in some sense, or one of the prophets that is necessary to lead us. Because in some sense, we need to discern the future, we need to plan, we need to know what to do, we need to fortify our understanding some way. And we can either fortify it with a blind faith or with a justified faith, and have a justified understanding. And and if we sort of if we give up, sort of the need to be convincing, we can really indulge in a lot of cognitive dissonance, as it were, which is why having some kind of mirror that reflects to us the face of at least reason and coherence, then perhaps we will be called through that outline to develop some kind of self-consistency. Sorry, I should have said reason and responsibility, not reason and coherence. That was a misspeaking. Excuse me, because the world, I think, could have reason and responsibility somewhat inside of it, but to be truly coherent, that's only a private, subjective, personal mind condition of understanding can actually be coherent. So the worldly mirror that we could hope that could somewhat outline and stabilize a healthy developmental psychological development, that would hopefully tend toward promoting. But I'm not trying to maximize tending in some sense. It's not. In some sense, I don't need the world to go this way. It's just my preference, as it were, because it would be more just, as it were. And I think that you can argue that justness even on purely secular grounds, but I'm making the broad intellectual claim here. Okay, but so I just want to say that scientism, as I will call it, which I think is much more widespread than even people who respect the term scientism. Many people do not. I think Dawkins, well, at least I've seen him repudiate the use of that word. and it fits nowhere in to his vocabulary. And I do appreciate Richard Dawkins somewhat, but I think that he has often fallen into this trap, and he does not understand perhaps this broader philosophical point. Science is based in what I'm going to semantically define as logic. Logic is not true or correct. We have to understand that therefore science is just a model of something, and that model can never be true or correct, but it can be logical. Now, you might be able to garner some utilitarian effectiveness from a system that is logical, because there's a kind of self-consistency there. But that self-consistency could very well be paradoxical. And in some sense, I think it has already been demonstrated and proven that science itself effectively refutes its own project, refutes its own methodology, in fact, because science needs temporal determinism to have its tests be, what's the word, meaningful, or in order for the scientific test to substantiate any kind of claim, you have to already assume determinism is in effect. Because science gains its value by saying, well, I can predict that this will be the outcome, and then you get the outcome, and then you get the gold star. You're ticked as being correct, as providing the right answer in science, because your hypothesis leads to correct prediction. Now, that assumes that we live in a deterministic universe, and we know that we don't. We live in an indeterministic universe, which is the more technically correct way to do it. You can somewhat get away with saying we live in a probabilistic universe, but not in the way that scientists try to say that. It's not statistical probabilism. We do live in a probabilistic universe, but you can only make that claim if you include within one of the things that might be doing the work of that probabilism, of that probabilism. You have to include all mystery, all possibility, in some sense, or you have to include the unknown, essentially. You can't. It's not statistical probabilism. I mean, there's no way to verify that claim. I mean, that's a blind faith correlation to make. And this is why I say essentially all of science essentially is a kind of cult of logic. And all logic is fundamentally is self-consistency. So yes, a mathematical model is self-consistent with itself. Katy Perry was correct when she asked Neil deGrasse Tyson, what does math have to do with science? He didn't answer the question. It actually has everything to do with essentially the philosophical edifice of science. Fundamentally, actually, that's what they end up relying on. Neil deGrasse Tyson's inability to answer the question, because this is actually the crux of the chink in the armor in their whole intellectual edifice. So essentially what I'm saying is we have to be very particular about people who have hidden assumptions built into their semantic definitions, and then they use those definitions with a highly rigorous self-consistency, highly logical, and then they're like, well, take this as an authority that it's as good as being true. This is why science is incredibly toxic when it tries to impede on political matters which involve morality. You cannot use somehow some kind of utilitarian efficaciousness of science to crowd in on moral questions. Well, I mean, this is especially true when you are using it in a precautionary fashion. I think Anthony Giddens, I can't remember the name of his theory, but he has some kind of theory. Oh, man, it's a bit of a shame that I can't remember the actual title of it, but essentially, in this theory, he reasons logically that essentially governments have the right essentially to trounce and trample essentially any right, because there is an unbounded potential pool of existential threat to society, and they have essentially a duty to the collective that supersedes anything else, and therefore essentially the state, in terms of whatever guarantees and protections it might offer to its citizens, are essentially just a kind of window dressing, and essentially power and authority, is, at least as he philosophically frames the political duty of a state, ends up becoming a kind of a god unto itself. Sorry, that could have been phrased a lot better if I actually referenced his actual formulation. It would have been more interesting. But anyway, and this is, I think, what happens when you become a slave in the cult of authority. It really becomes a monolith of nonsense, of reductive nonsense. And let me just give an example of this. So, like evolution, and a lot of people have taken evolution and evolutionary thinking as being something of a kind of scientifically endorsed epistemological paradigm and framework. Evolution can never displace epistemology, or it can never substitute epistemology, or provide for it. It doesn't even properly explain anything. It describes some things, and it does not describe everything. So their idea, in some sense, is that if we can have a description of everything, if everything can be covered by this theory, then the theory might as well be used as a causative explanation. We might as well rely on it as providing for substantiations that explain causation. But it even fails to do this. I was watching a Richard Dawkins interview, and I think he even, the most interesting parts of evolutionary theory are embroiled in essentially what is a fundamental nonsense paradox, that it thinks that it can get away with explaining away, and it never gets away with it. And Dawkins, for instance, explored essentially the controversy between Wallace and Dawkins, where, and I understand this is a bit of an approximation, that Wallace generally describes himself as being more Darwinian than Darwin, saying that, there must be some kind of utility in co-evolved, sort of gender, or within sexual selection, or with things that are co-evolved within sexual selection. There must be some kind of utilitarian metric, and or reason, as it were, or merit is probably the better word. And if something is co-evolved, that means that fundamentally, in terms of evolution, it can only be evolved as a combined unit. If something is co-evolved, whatever comprises of that co-evolved compound, that you can apply evolution to in some sense. And I would even argue that it's probably dangerous to do so, because anything that is co-evolved can, internal to itself, generate a sophistication and a dynamic that might envelop the whole evolutionary model itself, if it's capable of doing so. And if it does so, then it's just trumped evolution. And evolution, and I mean, perhaps this is why people have understood that it's at least incredibly dubious to apply evolution to the life form that we are, having essentially that we live more not in the natural world, but in the environment of our mental scape and our collective mental scapes, which in some sense probably is more determined by language and the structure of language than the structure of anything that evolution might be able to penetrate. And I would argue that this tends us towards understanding reason and responsibility more so. Is probably the most secular way of getting at what language entails and involves. And, in some sense, there's a kind of evolutionary natural selection within reason and responsibility, more so than any kind of selective pressure. And those things are much more sophisticated, much more morally deep, and in some sense is just a completely different scale of problem than what evolution is essentially there to describe, and what it fails to essentially in the end explain. But my point is that evolution has no resources to penetrate anything that is co-evolved, because it cannot see inside of anything that is co-evolved and work out what's actually relating in between those things, how those things are corresponding and relaying, so that internal interplay within the co-evolved set is beyond the grasp of evolution fundamentally. And projecting a kind of evolutionary matrix, saying that, oh, well, evolution already explains everything else, so obviously we should just take that and then project it inside the co-evolved interplay and onto the co-evolved interplay, is nonsense. It's reductive nonsense. And you end up having to have a completely ulterior or alternative paradigm of understanding and explanation. But you have a kind of logical hubris where you say, well, this is already so self-consistent and already seemingly explains so much, or I would argue it merely describes so much. But then as soon as it kind of comes across the topic, which maybe includes the topic of, vitalism, agency, life force, or something like that, which is something that is completely lost in the evolutionary reduction. There is no individual agency of a life form. It's using generalizations. In some sense, it's kind of trying to make a statistical survey and say, well, this selective pressure is going to cause this adaptation. It's trying to rely on a kind of probabilism. And again, this is all that science does, is it makes mathematical models. And you have to be very careful when it starts treading on the moral domain, or the domain of the intellect, as it were, because it's not going to treat it correctly, it's going to treat it morally. And so I would say that the false authority of the scientific lab coat, as it were, which has in some sense displaced the priestly class, at least within within the ordinary modern worldview, as it were, has been, in my view, the prototype of identity politics and any kind of narrative reductivism, or objective narrative importation and objection. In some sense, all of these, the reason why that this is a recurring theme is because this is the stuff that happens within psychology already, because people within their own personal psychology, within their own individual psychological schema, um, they are fallen in the sense of losing an internal locus of control and using some kind of paradoxical objective narrative in order to indulge in a kind of a game that they're playing, um, that has sort of, that they established, and then which kind of automatically seized the reins of operating the game, and then they are languishing within the structure that they collaborated in developing. And this is largely, I think it's almost an unavoidable process of individual development. It can be navigated optimally, it can be probably improved, pedagogy can be improved, education can be improved, the knowledge of psychology can be improved. That's what my work in psychology essentially seeks to provide for. But I think it would be useful if in the world there was reason and responsibility, so that people would at least not be given this automatic, as it were, collective delusion that the gift of the prophet is invested in a worldly power. I think that is the summary essentially of that is the engine of idolatry, in some sense, or sorry, that is the fundamental model of idolatry. And when it becomes, let's say, the convention through which a culture or a society is framed, that is at the very least suboptimal. So I have a preference to change the secular power structure. I don't have to the rule of law. This is why I'm like, no, we should not have the rule of man, we should have the rule of law. And that rule of law is not going to be a perfect law, it's not going to be a moral law, it's going to allow for moral anarchy, because that's what liberty means, is that you have to give people the freedom to do things, but it should guard against certain things that, essentially it should guard against the intolerance paradox. It should not allow other people to institute the rule of man. And we should mediate morality through our soft culture and through our moral judgments, which we should be free to be intolerant of one another, but that intolerance cannot essentially trample on the province of the law that seeks to have at least some standard of reason and responsibility. And in some sense, the thing that links the personal psychology with the structure of the state here is that at least then, if law is a field or a section of knowledge and pursuit and a kind of intellectual field that itself has a kind of worldly objective benchmark of carefulness and seriousness and honesty. Not truth, but honesty, at least. Truth is for the private domain, but it ensures a kind of honesty and carefulness and seriousness. Then at least then individuals can imbibe that culture to some degree and perhaps inculcate within themselves a degree of seriousness and carefulness and perhaps truth. Perhaps. So that is my parallel between the private and what I see as optimizing the secular public justice system, as it were, so that even that the judges are not kings, because the judges are subject to the law, and if they make the wrong judgment, it will be appealed and overturned, or a better judgment will come along, because there is so much independent structure that is not linked to the rule of man that it can't, the framing is substantial enough that it can conserve itself, that it can preserve its efficacy, as it were. And that is not an impossible task. That I mean, the Americans would excuse themselves. No, law must be experimental because there's no such thing as a perfect law. And I would argue that there might be no such thing as a perfect legal test. That legal tests might always be refined, but in principle, the law can at least be complete, and that it should be in the hands rather of jurists than of politicians. Although perhaps you could have some political oversight to perhaps. What's the word? What is the word? It's impeach judges. But I mean, I actually, this is quite sad that I don't know the answer to this question. I think in the South African experience, I don't know if a judge has ever been impeached ever. And I imagine that if a judge were to be impeached on specious grounds, that an appeal would be made, and the judiciary could defend itself, even because the judiciary, I think, in the end, deserves to be the essentially the ascendant branch of government, because it already is fundamentally accountable to the law, and it has to operate within those structures. And if there are enough substantive values and principles, if it's broad enough, it's not really possible to gerrymander. I mean, you can, but you're only going to get away with it if you live in such a generally dishonest society that people essentially tolerate it. That there is a kind of a huge appetite for tolerating that kind of corruption. And in some sense, the current cultural schism perhaps has these has some of these ingredients. But anyway, I think that there is still no alternative. There is no better system, as it were. And although the system is not perfect, I don't want a perfect worldly system, as it were. Also, because in some sense that's nonsense for me to say, because it would be impossible anyway. But yeah, I mean, tell me a better structure, please. And please don't you dare tell me of something of, oh, well, the rule of man, we can set it up so that the rule of man can check the rule of man, can check the rule of man, so we can play this kind of Ponzi scheme or this kind of shell game, and we can run away from our reason and responsibility, because that is essentially that is how this never-ending history of delusion and also subjugation, this is how the powerful and the enthroned get away with unaccountable authority, because of the lack of reason and responsibility. So to me, it's important to have a system that does these things, but it's not It's not absolutely necessary, but it is my preference, and it is something that I work towards, because I do think that it is. I mean, working to improve things. I mean, anyway, that's what my hope. That's what my discerning drives me towards contending. Let me go on to say that the I don't see society ever as becoming some, even the soft power in society, as it were, except as a whole, is ever going to be anything like a Unitarian church. This is my personal opinion. This is, other people can disagree with me. You can have your own personal opinion about it. But in my view, what would naturally be optimal or preferable, as it were, is that people would have church families. Because don't invest moral prestige, or don't invest into uh, a picture of the world that you yourself aren't privy to being part of the collective education. I mean, in a church, you can be invested in your church family because there is a collective responsibility, as it were, in each individual to share your truth and to have your truth be an educational, invest in things where you have the responsibility to engage and directly participate therein. And people need this because, the human condition, needs a lot of education. It needs a lot of pedagogy. And, obviously a church family, maybe you can say that the priest is like the father of this family or something like that, is the shepherd. But in some sense, in the actual aim of the church is that everyone should grow in the gift of the priest. Everyone should grow in all the spiritual gifts. And there you are, sharing so as to cultivate all the gifts in everyone and to share in the gifts that other people have to offer. And, you know, this is very intimate, and this is a kind of therapy, and this is, sort of boundary. um I mean, the actual description in the scripture of a church is that the members in particular are the body of Christ, and the description of communion is to drink the blood and eat the flesh, and to break the bread, which is also another symbol of the fleshly thinking, the leavened um, loaf, and to break it down and to consume it, and then to process it and digest it, and then consume the waste, to consume the excrement a second time. That is how careful and serious of a therapeutic process, while at the same time there is dreams, people are having dreams. The gift of the prophet is being shared, and that is the edification of the body. That is the spiritual program, as it were. And people need that kind of attentive, intimate therapy, as it were, because the human condition is broad and complex, and one has, and there are also, very interesting therapy tools. I would say that there's a lot that can be garnered from the annals of Scientology, even. Um, that could be imported directly into church models. Um, I mean, there are even things in Scientology, they're called group auditing. But anyway, so I mean, there are perhaps syntheses that can be, I mean, my view is that, in a church, someone who is doing something as delicate as auditing. I mean, in some sense, I think that this is largely the role of a deacon. And I do think it's better if deacons are young, um, and spry, and anyway, I mean, they don't have to be young, as it were, but they are somewhat quick on their feet because they are themselves newly educated and developed in forming these structures of understanding, and so they can also impart and share how that understanding might be developed, as it were. Um, but anyway, one can be young in more than one way than worldly age, anyway. But now, so in some sense, also what I'm saying is that when people have tried to take a church family and they have tried to project it on their friends and associates and their worldly community or their worldly democracy or their worldly structure, this, I think, is where we have fallen down, and tradition in some sense has encouraged this nationalism, as it were. Now, I believe in civic nationalism, and I certainly especially one that is constituted with a supreme constitutional order and a broad enough legal system and framework that you can have reason and responsibility, which is certainly something that I think should be taught in civics modules within the schooling system, as it were. But you know there is a huge scope for freedom of association to do what it would like, and for the democracy to try and encourage what it would like. But the democracy, in some sense, in my view, is barred against using the criminal law, inventing offences to police morality. They can police some things that are against morality, those things that get in the way of the intolerance paradox, like so, but victimless crimes, I think that there is a kind of problem there. But the democracy can take measures to try to discourage the things that it would like to discourage, but it just can't outlaw them. It can put policy and money behind, in some sense, prevention, but that prevention must be based on a kind of consent or a kind of, it can be perhaps pedagogical in some sense. So I think that the democracy might be able to flex its pedagogical muscles on society as a whole. It just can't flex the authority of the state in order to get its own way in terms of its own partisan morality. Anyway, if anyone was interested, that's how my self-consistent logical preservation of a constitutional order, how it would have a democracy. And democracies are always going to be somewhat finicky things, because in some sense, I mean, the one of the measures, or sorry, one of the functions of a liberal democracy is that it is an outlet of some kind of collective psychology. It is going to have, sort of a collective psychology, which in my view is always a dangerous and potentially nasty kind of thing. It's capable of getting into paradoxes and getting nasty and toxic very easily. But a lot of that toxicity is, I would say, confined or made impossible if you can't have the criminal law to infect with that paradox. I mean, this is I can get into a particular example, but I don't know if it's worth to do that, because this is, I've got so many threads that I've already brought up, and now I'm getting into the one, but and and it's interesting, I'm sure, but perhaps let me just rather stick to my overarching thesis, that essentially I just want to stabilize the world into such a way that I want to help the world sacrifice its flesh, its fleshly thinking. That's what I want, to help the world. I want to help the world to overcome itself, as it were, that the spirit of man will precipitate the Son of Man. And I think that there's a kind of stability that would tend towards that, or which would promote that, or something like that. It would make it easier. It would make it easier for people to understand their spiritual situation, some outline of their spiritual situation, and it would make it easier for them perhaps to divide themselves away from the world. Not necessarily it would do that job. It wouldn't necessarily make that happen, but it would be easier, as it were. So, I mean, I guess I could be called a partisan on some level. But, I mean, if I'm having a personal confrontation, or if I'm convincing someone that my doctrine and my understanding is justified, that's a separate argument which I can make on separate grounds, which is an interesting moral philosophical framework which I could also get into. But I mean, I've tried to. Okay, so maybe I should get into that, and I should just say, okay, so now I'm going to segue fully into a kind of a religious type discussion. So I was watching, and I've mentioned this in the last recording, and I think I might not have credited where I got this idea, so let me just amend that now. I was watching on YouTube, and there was a little interaction between Sadhguru and some people in California. I'm not sure exactly who they were, but I think one of them was, and I can't remember his name, but he's like a famous YouTuber. I think it was him, but he looked a little bit different, so not sure. And they were talking about belief, and Sadhguru tried to make this distinction between knowledge and belief, and I really, and he wasn't really making any kind of meta point other than saying let's just keep these things distinct, and I really appreciated this definitional neatening up, that you believe things that you don't know. And I think that understanding is all about belief. And that's why it's so hard to have a justified belief, a justified understanding, is because in some sense you don't know it. So at some point, how do you know the truth then to have a justified understanding? And eventually, I mean, this is quite obvious in my view, in my understanding, it's obvious, is that you have to arrive at it via negativa. You have to say, well, there's no alternative, essentially. Well, show me a better way then. I haven't come across it. And then you would have to say, in all humility, well, I might be wrong, so I'll have to listen out if somebody else can challenge my view. But I haven't heard anyone that can defeat my justified understanding and give me a better justified understanding, or a real justified understanding, because they would have showed that I didn't have a justified understanding. But I'm not wrong to say I might be wrong, but I don't believe that I'm wrong. Anyway, now I say properly, in some sense, there is only one true belief then. Oh, when I say true there, I mean it as an adjective. I don't mean that as that it is the truth. In an objective sense, in a narrative sense, I have my truth, which I make into the truth. And I call this, I absurdly phrase this because I'm trying to explain it to a worldly, let's say, I'm steel manning the worldly skepticism by saying this is a divine vanity, that I'm making my truth the truth, or this one belief, and this one belief is the existence of God. So I take that to be a vanity, a divine vanity, a necessary vanity. The definition of vanity that I'm using here is that subjecting the same in hope. And in some sense, it's quite, vanity is perhaps, maybe I'm using the word slightly incorrectly, because in some sense, or not, no, I'm not using it incorrectly, but I could have delineated this. This is very complicated, but I could have delineated it slightly more clearly. Is that in some sense this belief opens me up to vanity, because it actually permits vanity to be possible after making this claim. Because if when I say God, I'll have to define that, because otherwise it's not clear the point that I just raised. But my definition of God is that we all have the same source. All spiritual essence, or all belief or understanding or validity of such, or the source of all truth, is the same. It has the same Father. So it's a philosophical position, or it's a philosophical entity, or a source of all validity in philosophy. It's or you could also say a source of all authority over belief. There's a singular source to all authority in belief, and that that source is in common with everything. Okay, and that means that through that universal, therefore, it's possible to start subjecting the same in hope. But the reason why vanity is called such and has all its other negative connotations is because if you subject the same, something that you consider to be the same in your hope, you are, I would argue, in conjunction with the belief about God, if you share that belief about God or authority, that there's a singular authority, then you are being an auspice of that singular source of authority. You are being a representative at the same time. That's why it's vanity, is that you are borrowing that source, as it were. Now, the true holder or possessor of that source is famously in the Christian doctrine the only begotten Son, which has no power over the world. The world killed him. Okay, I mean, I somewhat just misspoke, but it is quite a complicated sort of thing to get into. But the how do I let's say I'm sorry, I'm just trying to think of the most clear way to delineate this, because it is very complicated. But the world and the spirit of man is essentially the same thing. And you can, in some sense, you can't compel the spirit of man to produce the Son of Man, so that you have a conversion, so that you bring someone out of the world. You can't force that. But you can use the Holy Spirit, which is exactly what the Holy Spirit testifies to the spirit of man. That's why this is the Christian novation from the Holy Ghost. It is similar to the Holy Ghost. But it is the part of the Holy Ghost that, through the technology of the crucifixion, testifies to the spirit of man. Now, that testimony leads captivity captive, but it doesn't have a kind of ultimate power, because the world as a category, the spirit of man as a category, is to be overcome, and it can be overcome by the Spirit. But this is not something that you can predict about the world, because the world as a category will always persist, as it were. When the kingdom has come and all the things that happen within you, you are quicker than the world. You overcome and transcend the world, and this is an active thing. It's not an event. It's not a historical. So anyway, so I should rather say that the only begotten Son does not have power in the world, as in being a part of the world. It doesn't have power, as it were. But strangely, you see, I mean, even between in and, then I had to qualify in and a part, in the context of being a part of it. It can have a kind of indirect power over it, but in some sense, the only thing that it really has power over is, in some sense, the capability to produce a Son of Man, or to have something that comes out of the world because it has received of the Spirit, or it has heard the testimony of the Spirit. But in Revelations, and those who are faithful are called and chosen. So the truth is The truth is something that doesn't exist apart of the world. It has to be, sorry, when I say apart, I mean a part of the world, but apart from the world, it can exist, essentially. Um, and in some sense, that is one of the realizations that precipitates the development of someone understanding the Son of Man. Um, okay. So, what I'm basically trying to say is that the world is not going to go away in some kind of general sense, but let's say within an individual understanding, it does get defeated, it does get overcome. So, I mean, this is the problem, is that spiritual language has already been imported into objective narratives. And as soon as you live in an objective narrative, in some kind of reductive framework or paradigm, you're just kind of, you're always part of that terrain. And you don't have a proper internal locus of control. You have to be imprinted on the powers and the dominions, and you are camouflaged by the environmental pressures, and this is exactly, in some sense, allegorically, what the snake symbolizes, because the snake is camouflaged in its environment. It's directly a part of the environment in some sense. It tries to blend into it. Um, and in some sense, that's why it's sort of the age-old anathema to at least the. But it's something that has to be overcome, and it's more complicated to overcome than just being apart from it, because you have to contend with the world, and you have to render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. And traversing the structure of the world with the technology of the crucifixion, which is, and it says in Corinthians, I die daily. You die daily on on with your crucified mind. Your mind is crucifying itself. Well, I mean, but so, I mean, I also want to elaborate on that, but anyway, I don't want to get too much in the weeds here. Uh, the work of salvation is an arduous one, which is why we need a church family, because there's a lot of education, there's a lot of spiritual edification which is needed. I'm not going to cover it in a lecture. And when people are finding substitutes for this spiritual nourishment, when they are trying to treat their nation as a family church, or they're trying to treat their community or a friend of the flesh, and or an association or something like that, it's I mean, it's a coping strategy, I would argue, to some degree. It's a coping strategy that invariably involves some kind of uh, persistent, perhaps even slightly evolving cognitive dissonance, some kind of shell game. Often people at some point get into cycles of recurring self-deception to such a point that they just kind of, they grow a kind of apathetic to to their own unfinished spiritual condition. Um, but sort of tending to this does require, in my view, a church family. Um, and that need has been, in my view, generally outsourced in depending on the gift of the prophet from some kind of worldly dominion or edifice or structure, um, which makes, let's say, the moral imperative and let's say the imperative in the human condition to be refined or something, or to search out the gift of the prophet, because it's a necessary gift. You know, in some sense, it is I think the greatest spiritual gift. But I mean, the other ones are also very important. Um, but you know, that is what, because you know, you need some way to solve, you know, the kind of the myriad uncertainties and what's the word, anxieties or doubts, as it were, until you have a justified understanding, essentially. Um, Sorry, I don't know if I'm doing my job. So going back to justifying my understanding, that the necessary belief in God being the common source of all meaning and value, perhaps, that there is a shared source of epistemic authority, as it were, um, that we have a shared Father, that is the Father to all that is proper essence, or significance, that there is the same author of value in creation, uh, means that there is a possibility of bridging what would otherwise be the abyss of solipsism, the loneliness of, because if there isn't a common author in creation of our incarnation uh, and the components of what we internally subjectively value and in our consciousnesses, um, you know, you essentially are prone to you can't bridge the solipsistic possibility, as it were, or paradigm. And so you need that to overcome solipsism. God is needed, essentially. The belief in God is needed to overcome solipsism, at least if you want to have an understanding. If you don't want to have an understanding, obviously you don't need that. You can just feel that solipsism is wrong. Um, and then you can add more and more sentiments, and maybe your sentiments are incoherent or inconsistent, but who knows, because maybe you'll feel that that's good enough, and so that'll be good enough for you, or something like that. But if you want to have a solution to solipsism and a solution to reason and responsibility simultaneously, or self-consistency and coherence, in a way that can enjoin a community that's capable of both respecting internal locuses of control and facilitating bridging that traverses the gulf of solipsism, then your work is a lot harder, and there are lots of problems and mysteries to have resolved. You know, and I would just argue, you know, sort of, I mean, this is very clear in 1 John chapter 4, where it says, you know, and they hear the world, and, you know, and the world heareth them, and, you know, we speak the truth, and, you know, those who are not in the world hear the truth, you know, like, because so it's, sorry, a bit of a paraphrasing, but essentially, this is all about how our minds are related to that solitary source of authority, or a sole author of all significance and meaning and value. Because to have some understanding of that, where you are the son of that, where the framework of your mind is the only begotten son of that, and other people can have the same framework, that then you can share the same framework, therefore you can effectively share the same father. But I mean, you need more than that to actually have a proper brotherhood. Or what you need to have a brotherhood is actual consent as well, to enter into communion. It's not enough. It's not enough to merely say, well, we all have this capacity or this possibility, and all those who believe like that, they have to actually form a church, as it were, a church family, which is not enough to merely say we could. You have to do it, as it were. Because in some sense our actions matter, our choices matter. This is just kind of the framework of agency. Of how agency starts to matter, and therefore we're actually listening to each other, not just giving them some kind of nominal piece of some objective paradigm, because we don't have the same gifts necessarily. And we may grow from each other's gifts. Anyway, sorry. Okay, so now where am I in my argument? So, or in my case, so in some sense, you can see that this belief is fundamentally nested in what I would call discerning, but what could also be called a hope, and it is a good hope. It is a hope to traverse solipsism. It is a hope to share and communicate with other living beings and sentient beings, as it were. And that hope is not a sufficient hope for a good life and a successful life, but it is a necessary condition. It is a necessary outline. It's not the gold, it's not the treasure, but it is the perhaps it's the cup that holds these things. Is the hard framework of the mind. So anyway, the hard outline needed at a bare sort of minimum. And within the cup as well, there are also these mysteries that have to be, and that goes into very detailed psychology and things like that. And it's not simple. I mean, if you read Revelations, you just realize how complicated. I mean, if you believe that there's anything there that's talking about anything real, I mean, this is incredibly complicated. The whore of Babylon, that's atop a beast that has 7 heads, and the 7 heads are like 7 kings, although it actually doesn't explicitly say that the 7 heads, because it just says, and there are 7 kings, but it also says that the 7 heads are 7 mountains, and it says that they are it also says that there are 7 beasts, and then it also says that there is an 8th beast, which is like the collection of all of them together, and the 8th beast is also of the 7. And it says that there are 10 horns, and the 10 horns are like 10 kings, but they don't have a kingdom as yet, and they rule 1 hour, uh, 1 hour with the beast. And it says that the beast, the total beast, is and is not and is yet come. Is and is not and is yet. So, there's a huge amount of content there. And if you believe that that's, it says, well, it actually literally says, and this description is for the wise. And if you think that, sort of salvation is going to be wrought without wisdom, and without the discovery and the transmutation, as it were. I mean, I can start talking about my psychology now, but I feel like I should put that in a different recording. In fact, that's also what's coming up. But I keep on promising that I'm going to give a presentation. I need to make it a live stream so that I don't have to mess with OBS or try some kind of recording program. I can just do my desktop and bring up the pictures one by one, and then use my mouse pointer as a pointer. But anyway, okay, yeah. So I mean, I didn't give a full sort of treatise, but life is the breath of life, I think, is really is the hope, which, in some sense has within it the door to heaven, which is also the manifestation of discerning. And that already kind of frames you in some kind of humility in some sense, because then you realize, well, I've just got this hope, and although it might have these excellent features and structures within it, other people might have other hopes which are, even capable of being salvaged in terms of witnessing and looking at and finding interesting things there, because that's really what we're sharing when we're sharing in each other's truth, if there is a communication or exchange of such. And sometimes hope can be quite badly distorted or dispersed or confounded, or sort of stuck in a kind of indecision, and a lot of times that kind of impediment, is sometimes it can be lack of an educational sort of. I mean, the real sad thing is that it's not necessarily possible to always educate anyone out of anything. They can have, or especially within the context of liberal freedom, they can have set for themselves a purpose and an impetus which simply leads them astray in quite a sort of perpetual sort of way. And, in Revelations, it's just said, and the kindreds of the earth will wail, and, whose names were not written in the book of life since the beginning of creation. But anyway, I've probably pontificated enough. I didn't fully go into the concept of justified understanding. I guess I'll have to think about some skeptical problems to the schema that I've just laid out. I have probably done this in other recordings. I've probably covered this topic slightly, but at least, and overviewed how to overcome certain of these problems. But I conceptually link solipsism and hard skepticism, I think, are very closely, because in some sense, you can just see how nihilistically they are driven in their hope, in some sense, to, and this is a game that a lot of people play, which sort of keeps them perpetually undeveloped and immature. My concept of cerebral histrionic, for instance, where you just kind of sit back and you want to play kingmaker as to which king you will take to be as one of the prophets, and so you will just kind of pick your favorite, or choose. You'll kind of amoralistically choose some conjecture, but in some sense that all of these paradigms have weaknesses, but you will still actually choose between them. So you kind of think that you have the best of both worlds, that that it's all a farce, that it's all a game, but you kind of nihilistically compel your hope to endorse, or in some sense, you're kind of hollowing out your own capacity to hope for something. And once you get into this kind of almost internal gerrymandering of your own hope, in sophisticating it in some sense, or sort of making it decadent, you, in some sense, you already know the developmental line of maturity. You know the path to maturity yourself to some degree, but you decline to seek, to journey, as it were, on that road, because you just figure that, well, perhaps it should make itself apparent. The true path, if it were in existence or something, like, you fail to hope. In some sense, it's probably related to that you have hope, but you're kind of agnostically pessimistic rather than being agnostically optimistic, as it were, if I can kind of phrase it like that. And in some sense, you have also used this craft of gerrymandering your own hope as a kind of substitute for God, or a usurpation thereof. And so, because there is no view in the common father of a source or something like that, you allow yourself this this internal, because in some sense you are projecting paradoxes, but in some sense you're doing so by what you do to yourself. So it is a kind of self-inflicted existential trauma, or you're engrossing yourself in a kind of self-inflicted existential trauma, but so therefore you think that you're paying for it, so you're allowed to continue to indulge it, even though you're kind of creating, I would argue, a kind of toxic eminence or atmosphere. I mean, this is what I've just described is probably a better description of the actual psychological state of people that I've criticized before for being cerebral histrionics, like Rationality Rules, the YouTuber. What I've just said could probably just be appended onto my critique of Rationality Rules. Okay, well, anyway, I've spoken quite a bit. So, there are lots of, in some sense, psychological strategies of obfuscating from, a proper developmental maturity, as it were, or self-actualization. And, people sort of, obviously it's easy for people to stop if they have things in the world that they admire and that have misled them and that have given them a false doctrine, perhaps, or given them a model of a doctrine which, anyway. And, generally I think this has to do with making a worldly, or making the gift of the prophet a worldly entity, or something that can be found in the world, as it were, and not in the understanding. Okay, yeah, that is, I think, enough, for now at least. Let me jump back in and round off some of the general themes that I have raised and the claims that I have made. So, this is not really a cop-out, I think, but there already is a very thoroughly substantiated delineation of epistemic agency found when, I think very clearly found when first reading Catherine Elgin's epistemic agency paper in the philosophy department in the philosophy of morality or epistemology or whatever. So Christine, I think it is Christine Elgin. Wow, getting things that I've dealt with so long ago. But yeah, I believe it's Christine Elgin. Catherine Elgin, excuse me. Catherine Elgin's paper. I hope that's right. My memory is not so good on names. So Catherine Elgin's epistemic agency paper. She's of Harvard professor, and combine that, and in some sense, more importantly, the essay written in a chapter in a book called On Nihilism, and the title of this chapter, written by Vasti Root from Stellenbosch University. She writes Living with Nihilism. Her essay on living with nihilism is, I think, a much more organic and fluid existential treatment of the philosophical issues. So if you somewhat combine both of those philosophical great works, if you can see what Vasti Root is essentially outlining is how you get to epistemic agency. And if I could just add some doctrinal description of what is in Vasti Root's paper, Vasti Root's essay in Living with Nihilism, in the book on nihilism, where a whole lot of philosophers wrote chapters in that book or wrote essays in that book. Many people were astounded by her essay because they quite clearly recognized it as the proper synthesis and resolution to all of the themes and issues, because I mean Nietzsche was some kind of philosopher, but he didn't understand his own philosophy, and he didn't write philosophy. He wrote fiction, and he wrote allegory of his philosophy, and you need a secondary synthesizer to make it understandable, as it were, or at least to actually get to any useful. It has to be processed for it to even be actionable or deployable in any sense. It's open to vast interpretation, but very few people have succeeded in even coming up with some kind of tenable synthesis that actually deals with all the issues that Nietzsche raised, as it were. And I've spoken a lot about Nietzsche, and I've kind of already alluded to this, but essentially, if you read Vasti Ruurt's essay, the thing that I'll just add onto this to contextualize it in my political assessment and my obsession with the rule of law is that it is ultimately preferable that the world and worldly power structures are not allowed to convene or produce a tout court which gets to decide over who should be considered one of the prophets, and that, in my view, the function of a liberal secular constitutional order is to prevent that from happening, because that will effectively institute a rule of man. It will be the umbrella or the disguise for the spirit of man to dominate man, or something like that. And essentially, as soon as you allow for some kind of tout court to be established in a power structure that gets to perpetrate this kind of the invocation of a kind of objective narrative, you can help to mislead and delude many people into thinking that they're going to be collectively saved by some kind of collective destiny or collective project, and that they don't have to seek the truth, and that they don't have to understand and all those sorts of things. And you have a kind of utilitarian maximization, behaviorism, sort of confected epistemic hollowing out, as Catherine Elgin would describe an epistemic reliabilism as opposed to an epistemic agent. And so, I mean, both of these works together will lead one through through at least in broad scale dealing with all the philosophical issues and obstacles, as it were, although obviously in the human condition, in the individual personal conditioning that one has developed, one's own false ego, to particularize those general lessons is a larger task that I would say requires something like a church family, and the intimacy of a kind of personal engagement to work through the collective effort and the collective discerning of those who have many different spiritual gifts to band together for the purpose of the work of perfecting the doctrine and reaching the full stature of the Christ. And it's interesting because just, as I say, that it's so important that essentially that there should not be a tout court in the world that seemingly gets to indicate some worldly thing as being one of the prophets, because that is truly ungodly, which is essentially why God goes through the motions of communicating the displeasure at the rule of kings. Where his preference is for the judges. And in Revelations, I'll just say two points that The promise of the kingdom is that we shall all be rulers and judges in the kingdom. That's kind of how it operates, that the kingdom is so beautiful, made up of all these beautiful gemstones and all these sorts of things, but there's no light with which to see them, because it is seen by the light of God, by the light of the Lamb, by the light of the only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, that is the light of the holy city. And so it is a beautiful and complicated holy city with all these things, but it's not, there's no earthly or worldly light to illuminate it. It's only the light of the understanding. To see that sophistication, as it were. But let me just say as well that the reason why I keep on talking about this prophecy thing, because it's interesting, because in Revelations it does quite clearly say that the testimony of Jesus Christ is the spirit of prophecy. This is a slight tangent, and I could have weaved this into an earlier theme as well, but let me just talk about, there seems to be a more fundamental schism between Islam and Christianity on this particular point, because Islam famously, the Prophet put a seal on the gift of prophecy, that there shall be no prophecy after him, that it is sealed. Although in Islam as well it talks about essentially that Isa will return, that Jesus essentially, which is in Islam Jesus, which is also considered to be the greatest servant to some degree, or the greatest messenger perhaps, or I'm not finding the right word, but Jesus is considered the greatest in some aspect, and he is the one who returns in Islamic, in the Islamic creed. And as I tried to outline before, that that this issue of prophecy needs to be experimented with to some degree in order to create the inspiration, the ingredients from which that we can achieve a proper spiritual understanding. And I see America performing the work of this experiment. It's perhaps slightly a diabolical experiment in some sense, because I keep on criticizing America, but I say that there is a potentially, there's a fruitfulness that it can be converted into. This is the transformation of sin into the sin that is not unto death, the transmutation into virtue. And so, and it's interesting that, somewhat there are echoes of this in the scripture itself, when God does permit kings to be established, even though it fundamentally is not justified in some sense, but that is part of the wrestling with God, as it were, to better perhaps understand how we are fallen. And let me just say that in this context, America is doing this on a sociological level, because to understand the Spirit, it is also, on some level, important to understand collective societies. It is said in the Old Testament that the Lord swallowed a city. So what does that mean? That the concept of lordship has swallowed a city. In some sense, this, I think, was one of the. We could have been a lot further along if we knew how reason and responsibility could work. But we also didn't just need to know how it worked on the individual level. We need to know how it interfaces on some kind of macro scale of a collective, because morality becomes more complicated or sophisticated. Anyway, but as I've already alluded to before, in my view, in Islam, the structure of that way of life ends up creating individuals who are very attuned to reason and responsibility on the individual scale. Because the sociological imagination is essentially cordoned, is excluded. And there are strands in Islam that understand that God set about producing perhaps different messages to different people. Although I would still contend that the proper reading of the Christian doctrine is that the message is for everyone. But that the Christian message is for everyone. But I do think that there is a product in Islam, which is that the individual Muslim is a good litmus test, because if it passes muster, if it can be condoned by a Muslim in some sense, there's a certain kind of in some sense, it's setting up the problem in such a way. I was going to get into this issue. It's there's a wonderful series, television series, which is based on the science fiction novels by Isaac Asimov, Foundation. And Foundation, I'll just say that, in my view, science fiction essentially is moral and philosophical investigation. Science fiction at its best is moral and philosophical investigation that contends also with the contents and themes of societal commentary and also and exploring themes of culture and society. So it's a kind of anthropological thought experiment that, in my view, at its best explores morality and philosophy. And essentially, I think that Foundation is exploring lots of many themes, and I think that I'm not going to 1,000% endorse something, but the themes in the Foundation series, I think, are certainly very spiritually important and profound. And although that I wouldn't say that the in some sense, the idea of plots is that is not that they are prophecies, is that they are mysteries, and in some sense, some rules of the plot of the narrative are made clear and known, or are implied, and sometimes the rules themselves are bent or broken, and that in some sense is a meta commentary on morality or philosophy in some sense, and it's obviously it's very engrossing, as it were. But I would say that generally the meta philosophy, or the meta ethic which is being explored in Foundation, is, on some sense, the capacity of the world to have a kind of fundamental infidelity to reason and responsibility, or self-consistency and coherence, and and that in some sense the cycles that it might produce being chaotic and in some sense piercing the hubris of humans, but that the need for destruction in resurrection and rebirth, I think, is essentially one of the major meta themes of Foundation. Necessary destruction, but that necessary destruction is not a clearly defined, is itself a hugely dynamic and perhaps spiritually deep topic, because destruction does not merely mean collapse, and in some sense the idea that you can have a style or a proper way of collapse, or that there are better and worse ways of having the right kind of transpired failure. That if you have the right style of failure that transpires in such a way that you can have a clearer, in some sense, I mean, what foundation is all about is what is a foundation, and this obviously echoes in huge major themes within religious and, within alchemy. The philosopher's stone is the cornerstone of the truth of all value. It is the thing that can transmute base metals into gold. But in some sense, as a kind of somewhat adjacent to spiritual alchemy or hermetic alchemy, which is in some sense has informed part of my research to some degree, because the objects of thought itself, the structures within thought, don't just have, they also have a mechanical set of attributes and features. And so it doesn't give you a full answer and a full picture of what's going on, but it's part of the story, as it were. Anyway, sorry, I'm just trying to justify why there is something interesting in alchemy, but a lot of these things are as L. Ron Hubbard has said, they're quite booby trapped. A lot of the occult essentially is just, it's full of strange doctrine and strange things that are sort of paradoxes that are meant not. When you proceed from paradoxes that cannot be resolved, then you're in a booby trapped, sort of gated game, as it were. But anyway, my point is that the foundation and perhaps the proper philosopher's stone is more fluid and dynamic and agile, and in some sense it is quicker than the world. It is not permanent as a part of the world. It does not appear necessarily to be permanent. But perhaps the world can still be helped, can still be managed in such a way so as to at least stabilize an outline, and we can reach a new epoch, as it were, of essentially a higher level. In some sense, Carl Jung seemingly prophesies about this in some way or another in Aeon, where he conjectures, that this is only going to happen in 300 or 400 years. I think if it takes that long, there will be an extinction event before then. So I'll just say I'm much more optimistic than Carl Jung, but I also I clearly see the challenge before me, and I don't expect it when my solution is deployed for it to be a worldly cataclysm or a worldly instantiation. That's not needed. Actually, you just need one nation, essentially. You just need one country. You need one legal framework and one legal system that has a common justice system, or making it a single nation and a single, and obviously I would also encourage proselytization of other people to change their systems to be likewise updated and improved. But that's a secular argument that can be made, and sometimes the best arguments that can be performed are done through role modeling and exemplification, is getting on with it and doing it, and leaving those others to witness and marvel what they're missing out on, as it were. So I really think that perhaps one nation is sufficient for me, or even not a nation. I mean, just enough people who agree and who create perhaps a freedom of association. As I say, you can have perhaps a pseudo-state that has this as its ideological commitment without the power or ability to instantiate it, but hoping and waiting for its preference to at the right moment be adopted by the secular structure, so that the world cannot produce this tout court that gets to seemingly create structures that can be confused as being one of the prophets. And in some sense, you'll never be able to stop people from generating ideologies that proclaim to be essentially one of the prophets. I mean, in my view, in some sense, I'm making a kind of claim because I say, well, essentially, Jesus Christ and the Christ consciousness is the gift of prophecy, and in some sense, in the way that that's a doctrine that can also be considered an ideology. But I just don't want it installed in the world. I want it only operative in the private, personal, soft cultural preferences of individuals operating within an open, liberal, democratic society, or at least an open, liberal society at the very least. But, I mean, one that has a consistent justice system, that has a common view of what secular justice means, and then you can have your own private views of what your private morality is, and how you want to privately comport yourself accordingly so, and perhaps have moral arguments with those who want to contend in those moral arguments or moral investigations or discussions. And that then I think will be at a much higher level of peace and of a kind of tranquility where we can all get on with it, and then we can also communicate to each other perhaps, or show each other the fruits of our labors, and continue getting on with it, and improve through cooperation and coordination, and not in some sense so much the game of dominion and powers and a kind of the enforcement of argumentation. And as I've tried to say, I think in some sense I can't give too many. I can't say everything that I want to say because it's quite controversial. Because if I start laying down doubts and dubiousness, it's very problematic for some people to listen to my recordings if I talk too roundly about Islam, about my reservations about some of how I think things have perhaps been interpreted in ways in which the other people have made these arguments. Western scholars who have studied Islam have said essentially that Islam was Quranified, essentially, that a group identity that wasn't really instantiated in the original message has kind of cropped up, because you have to remember that a lot of people were considered Islam by the Prophet, who were considered to be Islamic by the Prophet and part of Islam, who never knew the Prophet and who lived before the Prophet. Abraham was essentially said to be a follower of Islam. So Islam means something that in some sense has been replaced by a kind of identity, group, collective structure of power. And I think that is perhaps, anyway, and I can go, I don't want to digress further on that issue, but so there are things that I think have been essentially contorted, but let me just stop talking about that. But the individual Muslim, even with perhaps some of those prickly automatic sentiments and investments into an ideology which I think might be somewhat distinct from proper Islam, still in some sense offers an interesting model of individual reason and responsibility, and in some sense makes them a very interesting litmus test for hearing something that is self-consistent and coherent. Muslims often have very acute, attuned hearing to self-consistency and coherence, because in my view, what has been removed from their worldview is the ability to have a kind of sociological imagination to a large extent. And so they are left with just the personal interface with a system, with a structure of power. And so their reasoning capacity is, in some sense, uncontorted by false doctrine. It's a kind of litmus test, in the same, like literally in the same way that you might have a universal indicator. But this can also be, because you can also perhaps get some false readings if there's no patience or no carefulness or seriousness, or you can see Muslims quite rightly have a low patience threshold sometimes when they are listening to people who essentially are using semantics or saying things which very clearly is kind of seems unlikely to be incoherent. But sometimes, some things are quite sophisticated, complex issues. And there, in some sense, is very little psychology within the stricture of Islam. It doesn't really matter so much what you think, it matters much more what you do. And so as long as you control yourself into the right behavior, that's sort of good enough. And that sort of creates perhaps sometimes a much more strict obsession with proximate outcomes. And obviously when causality is truncated in such a way, because sociological chains of causation are off limits to your philosophical musings, you sometimes end up, I would argue, not properly bootstrapping agency and self-determinism and responsibility. You end up creating nominal tokens of such things, and that can be quite dehumanizing and undignified in some sense, which is generally, I would say, the general cost of many permutations of Sharia. But one can say that the compendium of Sharia gives you a general picture. You could say that it gives you some complete symbolic metaphor, or it gives you symbolically, in some sense, it gives you the right traditional expectations, the right picture of how things would work holistically. And so it gives you a kind of baseline of, it gives you a picture of what righteousness looks like. But pictures themselves of righteousness, you see that there's a slight problem there, because, and I mean, this magnificence is performed all over the Quran, when essentially it shows you the rule. It says this in a very strict way, and then it kind of outshines the harshness of the rule by expressing how a dynamic intelligence and poetry, in some sense, transmutes the picture and the expectation and the restriction into a balanced, holistic treatment. And in some sense, that's the problem, is that I don't know if, that's there for people to personally and individually develop themselves in the likeness thereof, or growing in the knowledge of that kind of thing. But I do think that is done and performed much better through a church family, in some sense, because you have to get into the weeds, you have to work through the complications, and you have to be edified perhaps by multiple sometimes problems seem hard to surmount or solve or see the resolution to, because in some sense you don't have all the pieces of the puzzle, and in some sense you have to make the problem harder still before you can find the proper resolution to it. And anyway, so I guess what I'm saying is that you really have to believe that you are participating in the spirit of the prophet when you're in your communion, when you're in your church family, and that you are communicating the spirit of the prophet. But you see, this is strictly forbidden, essentially. That kind of language, what I've just said, is incompatible with Islam. But in some sense, as I've said, I think I've said that the purpose of tradition is in education and pedagogy of children. And you need to start with some kind of basic set of a low-resolution picture, some kind of traditional worldview to grow from as the basis. And so I do think that there is perhaps something like that Sharia and Islam, in some sense taken holistically, is the default impression that perhaps should be given to the young and to the children growing up, from which to edify themselves further and to graduate from, not in some sense that they exceed it, but that they properly understand and have it inculcated in them in a different way than symbology and concatenation. Law in Islam, there's actually a rule in Islam that no law in Islam can be rationalized. There's actually a rule of irrationality. You can only take what was forbidden and what was permitted, and you can draw metaphorical extrapolation, essentially. You can symbolically, it's literally creating a series of concatenation. That you make a symbol that is a symbol that is the same and similar to what was prohibited or what was permitted. That's the only way that Islamic law proceeds. And in some sense, they do this, I believe, in some sense, to have a tradition and to have a custom and to have a system that gives a static, holistic picture. Obviously, that's the point of it. And in my view, as I've said, what is the true value of tradition? It's for children. But we must try to be ascended, the ascended man that understands the will of God. But as I say, anyway, so I see how these themes eventually are married in the project of humanity. The messy masterpiece that eventually comes together, as it started, according to the scripture, of all the great religions, and perhaps the religions that don't agree with this are more philosophies, which there are some interesting great philosophies out there, but all the great religions essentially say that we come from one, all born from Adam. Anyway, all fundamentally brothers.